Are you ready to get your button pushed? You're tuned in to What's the Reason for This, the podcast where music meets madness, friends become family, and every conversation finds its own groove. Kick back, laugh loud, and let's find the reason together. The button has been pushed. Hello and welcome. What's up, guys? Kodi back. Sorry to see Shay isn't here. He is actually in Las Vegas for one of his friends' weddings. So I have the honor of introducing our next guest. His name is Anthony DeCurtis. You may have seen him. He is a biographer, a music critic. He is an professor at the creative writing department at University of Pennsylvania. He has worked in partnership with as an editor in Rolling Stone. So he wrote a biography about Lou Reed. There is a lot that you have done, Mr. DeCurtis. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day and joining me here in the dungeon digitally.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And for people that don't know who you are, I reached out because obviously we're a music podcast, right? And we talk on a lot of items, and sometimes it's superficial items. But for me, I really wanted to dig a little bit deeper. And when you look at your resume and how much experience you have in music across all these different genres, I had reached out, I shot you an email, and like I do with most of my guests, I just put my emotions into that email and I asked for that opportunity, and you were kind enough to respond.
Absolutely. Well, the things that you're talking about, the kind of context of music, the background of music, the depth of it, the meaning of it, that's what always attracted me to it. I mean, I listened to the radio as a kid, completely responded to it. But, as I got older, and just began trying to figure out the world a little bit, music became one of the most important ways for me to do that. Any opportunity with someone who respects that approach and takes it themselves, I'm all about it. So thanks for calling on me.
And I always tell people energy attracts, right? And I know that I have a big energy, and sometimes that deflects people, and that's okay. But it also brings people in, and it allows us to have conversations like we get to have today, right? And so you talked about music being a huge influence on your life. Obviously, it's the same for me, and more than likely for almost all of our listeners. What was that moment, or was it maybe a band or a stroke in time in your young age that was like, hey, this is what I really...
Well, when I was a kid, I'm 74, so I was growing up in the 1950s and into the 60s, obviously. I grew up in Manhattan, so I was in New York. We had great radio stations, and there was Elvis and all of that stuff that I heard and enjoyed. But probably the real breakthrough moment, of course, was the arrival of the Beatles in the United States. That was it. There are so many musicians I've interviewed over the years who've talked about, seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan and how cataclysmic that was. And it certainly was for me. And that kind of sent me on my journey, all of the, what were they called, the British invasion bands, particularly the Rolling Stones were very important for me. I remember doing an interview with Mick Jagger later on, and telling him, I said, the Rolling Stones were like the first band that I felt like required my defense. They, my teachers, everybody, would pat you on the head for liking the Beatles. And look, I love the Beatles, so I'm not putting them down in any way. But, when the Stones came along, there was an element of kind of bravado to them and, a way of approaching things that was rebellious. And it was, that tied into what was beginning to happen in the 60s politically. And so even my friends, who, I'm Italian American and, growing up in Manhattan, there was, all of the doo-wop and all of that other stuff. A lot of my friends were still hanging on to that. And, the Rolling Stones were the last thing that they wanted anything to do with. But I was really just kind of gripped by them. And
Why do
so,
you why
go
do you
ahead.
why do you feel that that is? Do you feel like maybe it was the influence of like the African American community and the blues early on with the Rolling Stones, or the different sound or the bravado maybe that they brought early on in a generation that obviously that came to light as we ran through the 60s and into the 70s, but being some of those early voices, do you feel like it was just a little too much for people to hold on to?
Certainly, it was too much for people to hold on to. What interests me about your question, and what strikes me that really I haven't really given it much thought, was like what exactly the appeal was to me. Like why I was so drawn to it. I can tell you what I felt about it. I remember, I used to, there were all these kind of cool magazine stands and everything. I grew up in Greenwich Village, as it happens. And so I could get to pretty interesting stuff that I think was hard for most people to find. I would look at magazines from England and stuff. And I remember showing a cousin of mine a picture of the Rolling Stones taken in like 1963. They're standing on a street corner. And he just goes, "My God, they're ugly as sin." Uh, I remember like Jagger, there was, Jagger now looks, even at 82, he's got his, 35-year-old girlfriend, and, he's got that sexual magnetism. But back then, he didn't look the way you were supposed to look. There was something about all of that that made me excited. People talk about the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and justifiably. But when the Rolling Stones were on Ed Sullivan, just a few months later, Mick Jagger just kind of wore a sweatshirt. He wore it like what he would wear in a club. Like that was unheard of. No one would do that. It just, the shock element of it was something that I definitely responded to. Um, you know, and the music was great. And, you're exactly right. That doing songs like, It's All Over Now, and uh, Not Fade Away. And it was different stuff. It was different from what pop music was. It just, it was kind of a little hipper. Even as a kid, there was something that really sort of attracted me to that.
So then over the next years, right? Because this is early on the 60s. There's barely a television in every home. There isn't the abundance of information like we have now. So what did you feel like it was for the culture to have these movement happens, but the timing took a lot longer, right? To bleed in. Like you said, you're in Greenwich Village. You are in the heart of one of the biggest cities in the world. You have that available to you. But now you go out to like Topeka, Kansas, right? Or you start getting out into these other areas, it takes a long time to bleed in. And so that growth and the love and the questioning of this music and the exposure of it, something like the Ed Sullivan Show helped get in front of those homes. But what did you feel like the journey was like for bands back then to try to like break through and change that perception?
Well, I'm always fascinated to read um, the story of bands coming to New York and coming to the US from England back in those days. The Stones were kind of a thing in New York, in the way that like New York will go crazy over anything that, seems bad, or, and also, they, like Vogue magazine would get interested in the Stones, because, they were bad boys, and, these pretty girls would chase them around. Um, but yeah, once they got out across the Hudson River, things are a little bit more slow. They would go play in places, and there weren't many people showing up. There was no infrastructure for rock and roll back in those days. I always like to tell people, one of the first, possibly the first major gig that the Velvet Underground ever played was in a high school in New Jersey. These bands would play anywhere that would have them. But gradually it built up, and there's and something like the Ed Sullivan Show, which, had a gigantic audience. The United States was a lot smaller back then, population-wise.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what is the population now? Is something like, what, 330 million or something? It might have been not much more than half that back then. And so, if you're talking about an audience of 73 million people watching the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, that's a hell of a lot of people.
That's a
And
majority of the country that are tuning
yeah,
in.
and that's, that really has an impact. That's something that, these are things that get batted around all the time, but there's something about, I mean, our culture now is so fragmented. It's hard to, you talk to people about something that to your mind is huge, and they're like, oh, who's that? Or do they have a record out? Whatever. And not that these people are not paying, they're just paying attention to something else. I talk to my students, and, people say to me, well, do they know, who these bands are that you wrote about? And I said, well, some of them do, and some of them don't, you know, I mean, the one great thing about digital culture is you can go find anything, in a way that, like, if I read an interview where Eric Clapton is talking about B.B. King, I would have to go scour record stores in New York to try to find B.B. King albums,
Mm-hmm.
and, it's extraordinary now that you could just, somebody mentions an artist that you think, oh, that might be interesting to check out.
And then
And
you
then you
pick
get
this thing up and
every single record they ever made, and I love that. But there's also something that in my more nostalgic moments, I kind of miss, the effort of, really having to seek something out. Or I remember a friend of mine told me, this is even later, like in the 70s and even early 80s, the British folk artist Nick Drake, that people got interested in because of, his wonderful songs. But all of his records were out of print. And
mm,
he made a deal with a friend of his, like, look, we have to promise each other, like, if we ever find one of Nick Drake's records, we'll share it. We'll tape it for each other. And that kind of thing, there's a sweetness to that, and uh, a commitment, as opposed to, oh, Nick Drake, here's everything he ever did.
well, yeah, and you look back to like one of my favorite bands of all time is the Grateful Dead, right?
Mm,
And the
yeah,
tapers and that taper culture is really what helped elevate them and their popularity. But like you said, it's such a fragmented part of society. It was only this little subculture that really knew who it was. But then there was people that had a perception of what they thought that subculture was as well, right? So it's the people that are actually part of that community and then the perception of the community from those outside. And so similar to like the Rolling Stones, it's hard because you have to battle what is and what isn't, but there isn't this great way to do that, right?
yeah. I mean, the Dead, I went through a very strong period of seeing the Grateful Dead. And the way that started, well, it isn't how it started. I, I would go to the Fillmore East, which was walking distance from my family's apartment. And, when a band like the Jefferson Airplane would be in town, they would do two shows on Friday night, two shows on Saturday night, and then typically they would do a free show in Central Park on Sunday. And the Grateful Dead would do that too. And I went to see the Dead one time, and I kind of didn't get it. How old would I have been? Maybe 16. I kind of, I just, I mean, I was into, I mean, this sounds kind of a little embarrassing to say, but like stars, like kind of
Like the
English.
big names.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or
Yeah,
just, even the Jefferson Airplane had Grace Slick,
for
or
sure.
the Dead had, the Dead, it was like hard to tell, like, okay, who's doing what. And they also had this great, I mean, these things that I eventually came to love. But like when they were on stage, they would talk to each other for like 5 minutes between songs,
Hmm.
just, I mean, I don't mean talking to the audience, I mean like whispering to each other and lighting a joint or whatever. And I was thinking, like, what's going on here? Like, I don't get it. Like, this is a show. And then, when I went to college, when I was, 18 or 19, I guess I was 18, friends of mine said, look, you've got to come and, and see the Dead with us. And once I started doing that, and it was when the new Riders of the Purple Sage were opening up, Garcia would be on stage for like 8 hours. He'd play with the new Riders. Then the Dead would come on and do an acoustic set. Then the Dead would do an electric set. I was there the night they jammed with the Allman Brothers,
That's
at the
awesome.
Fillmore East. Those were just extraordinary experiences. But yeah, it was something that, that thing, word of mouth, your friends telling you, and you're going, all right, yeah, man, I'm open to that. Let's see what it is. And then suddenly you're in.
Do you feel like it was potentially the long jams or the improvisations from the Grateful Dead that kind of deterred people? Because at the time, rock and roll was really about like those radio cuts, right? Get in and out, get on to the next one, and
Yeah.
fire away.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. They didn't look like rock stars, it was part of the problem for me, you know, and, this sounds so naive. And now I'd love to, no one ever taped these free shows at Central Park, I don't think. But I'd love to sort of see one, to just see what it would look like to me today.
Mm-hmm.
And for me to try to enter what I was looking at when I was a kid.
Walk through that portal and go back into time and try to
Yeah,
re-listen to it now with all of the.
see if it made any, if I could say, oh, okay, that was it. That's why I didn't really get this. But they were, they didn't have hits. You know, they only had, by that point, maybe one or two albums out,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that I, for the most part, hadn't really heard. And so it was a little bit lost on me. I'm somewhat ashamed to say.
Well, and it's not being ashamed because I think that it took a long time for that evolution and then that fandom to really come, right? And then through the 70s, the Europe tour in 72,
Yeah.
and then coming into the 80s, changing their sound, right? Having a little more of that boppy disco sound to their rock and roll, right? With playing things like Iko Iko and The Women Are Smarter, and they're a little more bouncy, right? And they're not so much spacey and jazz. And I think it's cool because for me, you see that evolution over time and them not losing their sound, but shifting the dynamics within as the generation and that culture is evolving.
Well, it was really one of the things I loved when my friends started taking me to see the Grateful Dead was like they'd do some, long jam, and then they'd play like, Good Lovin' by the Young Rascals, or, something like that. I loved that they were just kind of open. Or they used to play a song, strangely enough, that I was familiar with because for some reason my father, who mostly loved, I guess what we would call the Great American Songbook, like, Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett. We'd listen to that stuff on the radio all the time. But, also he got into country music for a while. And so when the Dead would do like a Merle Haggard song, Mama Tried, I knew that song. I was just struck, by their range and how kind of open their ears were and how much fun it was. It really was fun.
Well, and I mean, for Jerry, like everybody remembers him as the guitarist for the Grateful Dead, but he also played in bluegrass bands, right? He played in acoustic bands, and so he had that foundational knowledge and he had that ear for it. And I think a lot of the times that is what he was chasing when he was off stage from the Dead, because it came this beast that he could not stop. But his passion really went back into bluegrass, and so trying to tie some of those things in and taking some of these foundational and traditional country and bluegrass songs, implementing them into their rock and roll or their jam phase,
Yeah.
and then starting to create this genre, right? And now we roll in through the 80s, then you start getting a band like Fish that puts together, right? And now this beast is being created. What started off as like these oddballs doing something different, it starts creating their own genre, right? But they're also pulling back from those foundational genres.
This is something I tell my students, there's a certain amount of nostalgia for the old days among them. And I always say, like, look, you're creating a culture. You're not just, I mean, culture is so overwhelming now. We're on this screen and you know, it can feel like there's just so much. But, I tell them, like, you're shaping it. You're shaping what this culture is going to be. So don't worry. I mean, you can love all the stuff I loved. I mean, I'm happy about that. But, you don't need to be, kind of daunted by it or, long for it. Look for your own directions. And the jam band scene is, I think, in many ways, the perfect example of that. Nobody really would have predicted that, but people just got into it because they liked it. And the fact that, like, almost any musical style is welcome on that scene, I mean, it's just phenomenal. I mean, that's really just great.
It's crazy because you can literally have someone who has influence from electronic music.
Yep.
And now they're inspired by that, and you get a band like the Disco Biscuits, right, or STS9, and you just start feeling these different things, and then you start seeing bands like Yonder Mountain String Band with Jeff Austin, right? So now you went from like traditional bluegrass to now like fast grass, and you had newgrass revival. There was like the Kentucky Colonels. There was some stuff like this that took old timey traditional music, sped it up, and then started to make their own. And then as that time evolved, in the early 2000s, now you're having like the String Cheese Incident, the infamous String Dusters. You're having all these bands that are coming in. They could be traditionally trained or whatever it may be, but they're adding something different flavor to it. And now the branches of all this music and this genre just starts to grow.
Yes. And I mean, 2 points I'd like to make in relation to that. One is that the founders of all of those types of music are also welcome. All the musicians in that scene, for the most part, are open to sharing their music with people from other styles of music. I mean, I remember, you know, interviewing, Trey Anastasio one time, and he was telling me about like what it was like. And they did a show out in Coney Island, and you know, backed up like Jay-Z on a couple of songs, and like, he loved it, man. You know,
And then the polar opposite spectrum is Fish had a show in New York, and they had the Del McCoury band open for them, as
yeah,
traditional bluegrass as it can be, right?
yeah.
So you have Jay-Z on one end, Del McCoury on the other, and then you have Trey and Fish like in the middle, and it just shows you the outliers of where these things can go.
And what's great about that is that as long as it's, I mean, this is, I don't know how this necessarily relates, but I remember when I was looking for an apartment one time in New York, which is a whole process. And,
My wife is from the Bronx, so I know I'm well aware.
I had a realtor helping me. She was taking me around to see all these places, and then they're expensive. And I was, a little bit reluctant to dip my toe in. And she was telling me about some of her other clients. And she said, somebody, won't look at anything that's not in a pre-war building, or somebody won't look at anything that isn't like just built right up to the minute with all the mod cons. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, well, what would you say about me? And she said, you're just kind of interested in what's good. It sort of, and I could show you any kind of apartment. And if it's a good example of what that would be, like, you respond to it. And I feel like that about music. I don't never really felt like, oh, that's this. I mean, look, I prefer, like everybody, I'm sure, certain types of music to other types of music. Mostly, I feel like if I mean, I don't really feel like I have guilty pleasures. If I hear it and I like it, whether it's, the biggest pop song in the world or something that's completely obscure and avant-garde, I mean, I'm all about it. I'm into it. And I feel like that, that sense of, Del McCoury on one hand and Jay-Z on the other. I mean, that sounds great to me. I mean,
Well, and that's what's crazy is like society, I always compare it to like sports fandom, right? Like sometimes you have these fans that are like, well, I like this band or this genre of music, so then I can't like this, right? And it's like, why are we putting these barriers up? Like if someone listens to country music, then they have to hate rap music, right? Or if somebody listens to the Grateful Dead, then they have to hate Fish. Like there's just these weird barriers that we put up. And why do you feel like we do that as fans or as a society?
'Cause that's not about music. That's about identity. And you know, I mean, in a way, music is always about identity. But it's what do you accomplish with that? When I talk to people and they're telling them about something I like. Now they don't have to like everything I like, but like if they're just dismissive of it, I always just say like, look, man, you're not denying me anything. I've got it.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm responding to it. If you don't want to respond to it, that's fine. That's your choice. You have to think about, are you denying yourself something? Because why not be open? Why not try? Why not give it a listen?
Well, and I think that sometimes it takes some of these musical experiences to challenge your status quo, right? Just like for you saying that you saw the Dead in Central Park compared to going seeing them with your buddies, right? It finally allowed you to open a door and see something that you didn't see before, right? So
100.
so sometimes it takes like that friend, right? That brings you on or that continues to say like, "Hey, no." And I have a buddy of mine, his name is Greg, he's my best friend. He came and visited me when I was living abroad in Mexico during COVID, and I had him listen to this band Goose. And he's like, "Hey, who is this? What's going on?" And I was like, "Oh man, just listen to this. It was something that I had gotten into because I had seen them at Playing in the Sands with the Dead and Company." I was like, oh, "Okay, hey, I like this." I shared it with him. He is now obsessed, and I wish that I had never started that fire because it is literally like, "Hey, I'm going to 40 shows this year. Like, did you listen to this one lick?" And it's cool because like you see that passion light off and run, and now I know that he has shared that with so many other people. And so for me, I love being able to do that and like continuing to push people. I saw Billy Strings in 2018, and for me, like you said, it just clicked. Like I saw something, I heard something, and for me, it was like, wow, this is what I had been chasing. Because what drew me to Yonder Mountain early was Jeff Austin and how fast that they played, but it was also the storytelling of like On the Run, right, and 40 Miles to Denver, and telling these folk stories with this bluegrass sound. And then for me, my mom was a Deadhead, so I was a huge influence in that and the storytelling from that, but then the jammy and the guitar. So when Billy Strings came, it was kind of like that blend of both, right? That fast jamgrass as well as like that jam band, but he also has that foundation of traditional bluegrass. And so for me, it was like the best of every world. And it was super fun because you see a musician like that grow in our bluegrass community. It's not a huge community, right? But for somehow he deserves it. Now this musician, this bluegrass musician, is filling out arenas, right? And like that is something that no bluegrass musician would think is possible. But he also said like, "Hey, I'm not going to play the Grateful Dead anymore because I don't want to suck the teat of the Grateful Dead because there's so many people that try to emulate what they did." He had an interview and he goes, "I want to be my own Grateful," right? And so, how hard do you feel like it is for someone to not only transcend genres like that, but then to battle some of these like perceptions of what was before needs to be what is in the future? And then being able to take that stand and be like, "No, I'm going to build something of my own and go off."
Well, I think one of the things about Billy Strings and why I feel like he's been able to build such an audience is pretty much he does exactly what he wants to do. And that sounds like such a cliche, but it's true. He's not strategizing. He's responding to what he feels inside himself. And yeah, that element of, I mean, essentially like, playing hard rock or playing, a song with Willie Nelson or, that kind of thing is, I feel like that is, just, I think people do respond. I mean, I'd like to think this, I mean, somebody probably could find 100 examples of when this isn't the case. But I do think that people respond to openness. That if, a musician or an artist is displaying a kind of passion that exists within themselves. So he sings about the things he wants to sing about. Sometimes they're pretty dark, sometimes they're not. He's a hell of a player, are drawn to that style of music. I mean, you just have to respond to him. And, he's a great singer. And as you said, he tells these stories. And, there's a kind of unpredictability to him. There's a kind of sense that, where is he going? What is he doing? And it's not contrived, I mean, I don't really feel that thing, oh, this band, like, they need to reinvent themselves. And, I'm like, well, I don't know, man. Like, if you like what they're doing, like, why do they need to reinvent themselves? Or if they like it, like, let them keep doing it, keep writing good songs or recording good songs. And, but, Billy does keep himself fresh. There's a sense of, even when he does the most traditional things, and he's so aware and so respectful of the tradition, but he doesn't play it. It doesn't feel like school, It feels like he plays it like it's never been played before. Not that, I mean, he knows it's been played before, and he knows that these songs have been done before. But I'm sorry about these sirens.
No, you're in New York City. That's what the backdrop should be.
The reality.
1,000%.
Here. But he'll play, a bluegrass standard with all of the energy and commitment of a song that he wrote yesterday. And that makes a difference, and it's not like he's trying to reinvent it. It's not like he's trying to, it's like the immediacy of his passion comes through in his playing and in his singing. And again, whether it's one of his own songs that he just wrote for whatever record he has out, or one of the old songs that his stepfather, or he would say his dad, turned him on to, he plays it with the same level of energy and commitment.
Well, and I think that he is just so unapologetically himself. He is genuine and he is vulnerable. And I think that as he grew, we had talked about like Ed Sullivan and the shows and things like this. Billy did a great job of connecting with his crowd and with his people, not only by visiting them outside while they're waiting to get into his concerts, but by going live on his Instagram after a concert from the bus and just talking or walking through things, or hey, I wanted to play this song, and now he plays it in the bus, and you feel like you really get to know him. But then his storytelling and his lyrics are so raw and so real, and you can hear all of this emotion. And for me, like, you can hear it in my voice now, like when you get those feelings from music, like you get that chicken skin, and that is when you really feel the magic that is behind some of this stuff. And I think that because he's so unapologetically himself, and he's such a strong songwriter and then a phenomenal flat picker on top of it, it's just like having a 5-tool player in baseball, right? It's like everything that you would want from someone as a musician.
Well, I remember it was 3 weeks ago. I was at a conference. I'm on the board of directors for the Bruce Springsteen Archive, and we had a little conference at Monmouth University where they're actually building a building to house Bruce's archive. Anyway, Bruce was there. It was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Born to Run. And all of the members of the E Street Band who played on that record were with him on a panel. And it was great because Jimmy Iovine was there. Jimmy Iovine was 22 when he mixed Born to Run, And they were talking about how, they didn't know what they were doing. They kind of didn't really know what they were doing. Steve Van Zandt, they were working on 10th Avenue Freeze Out, and they had brought in, like these kind of fancy, very good horn players. because, they wanted a horn part on it. But Bruce said, he goes, I was up in the, I was up in the, I was up in the control room because I was like intimidated by them, you know? But Steve Van Zandt came because Steve had never been in a studio before. And he said, he goes, I had no idea what studio etiquette was. And so Bruce played me what they had done on 10th Avenue Freeze Out. And he asked me what I thought of it. And I said, it sucks. He goes, people were, even at that point, tiptoeing around Bruce, He goes, but, I just told him what I thought about it. And he said, oh, yeah? Okay, well, then why don't you go down there and fix it? And so Steve goes, okay. And so Steve goes down into the, into the studio proper. And he starts to like Michael Brecker and all these incredible horn players and say, okay, you play this part, you play that part. He had no idea who they were.
And he's 22, has no studio experience. And he's like, fine, I'm going to come in here and do this.
Yeah, you want me? And it's that great horn beginning to 10th Avenue Freeze Out, And Bruce, everybody was obviously laughing a lot, telling these stories. And, Bruce, I think it was like Jimmy Iovine said, like you had us and none of us knew what we were doing. And Bruce said, yes, but I had the people I wanted. I didn't want professionals. I didn't want somebody who was going to be playing on my record and then a week later going to play on somebody else's record. I wanted the people who believed in the music that I was making, and wanted to be there with me. And we would find out how to do it. We would figure out how to do it, not because we were professionals, but because we cared. And, coming the long way around to Billy Strings, I feel like, Billy is a little bit like that, like when you talk about, playing songs on the bus and, doing these other things that reach out to fans and to his audience and connects with them, it's not like, oh, well, I'm not getting paid for this or whatever a professional musician would think. He's doing it because he wants to do it, because it's fun and it's exciting.
Well, and in
it
his
doesn't end when you walk off the stage.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, because just recently he was the keynote speaker at the IBMAs, and he had a long speech as well as an interview afterwards, and he talked about the music keeping him alive, right? And how it really is everything to him. But he also, because for us we see him as this huge figure now in bluegrass, he talked about not being accepted by those traditionalists, right? And even though we know that he has that foundation, he talked about being cast away or not invited because of the long hair or the ears or the tattoos, right? And it's crazy because now there's similar things happening where traditional bluegrass fans don't respect what these jamgrass bands are doing, where they're speeding things up or they're getting more experimental or they're bringing different things in. Well, that's not bluegrass, right? When realistically what Billy was saying is hey, it's all within this slice. We need to be more inclusive. It starts to branch out and create different slices like we talked about, but how do we as a community become accepting to all those instead of this like mentality of no, I don't want to share this. It has to stay that it always has been. Kind of like your friends that didn't want to listen to the Rolling Stones.
Exactly. I think that, that idea is nothing would change. Nothing would even develop. We wouldn't have had bluegrass if people thought the way these people thought, back when, the inventors of bluegrass, invented it. I mean, you have to allow, the new thing doesn't eliminate the old thing. It doesn't erase the old thing. It's neither better nor worse than the old thing. It's just new, and it feels contemporary. And, that is something I've never really, understood. And I say, nobody has to like everything. I keep coming back to that. Because sometimes I feel like, like someone might listen to what I'm saying and like, don't you have taste? Don't you have preferences, And
you did. You said you like good music. That doesn't mean you have to typecast yourself into one genre or one style.
Well, exactly. And I don't, particularly feel that you want to give it a chance. That's how music lasts. I mean, that's how, rock and roll is hung around, and certainly bluegrass or any genre, rap, like it, if somebody doesn't come along and try something new, then it just becomes ossified and, a museum piece or
What
just.
do you think it is about some of these foundational genres that have always kind of been the pillar, like the pop, the country, right? The rock and roll now. I feel like they came in and now, like you said, the bebop of the 50s. No one listens to it, right? It's not even on the radio anymore. So what do you think that it takes for these genres and these bands to not only get to that place where they have that standing ground, but then to hold that ground so that it's not swept away and then moved on to the next thing?
I think being open, I keep coming back to that, to new ways of trying to make that music, you know, because music doesn't exist in some abstract realm. It exists as part of our history. And look, bebop really meant something when it was developed, and it's phenomenal. I mean, when you listen to it now, you're going, you lose your mind with how
Mm-hmm.
powerful it is. But, it's not necessarily a form that would have been invented at the moment, and, for jazz musicians, jazz has been tough in this regard. I remember as a kid when I was trying to learn about music, I remember like, okay, pop music is on the radio. Okay, I get what that is. And rock and roll comes along. Okay, I get what that is. But then, folk music, all right, I'm down in Greenwich Village. All right, I can figure out what that is.
You're in the hotbed.
And then, but then like jazz, man, I couldn't, like, I lived right around the corner from, one of the great jazz clubs in New York, the name of which I cannot recall right at the moment. Like, if I went to see one of those shows, man, nobody was really, especially inviting me to be there. Like, it was like, do you know about this stuff or don't you? It was like, well, I'm trying to learn about it. I'm trying to find out about it. And, I think, jazz has suffered from that. I think, look, it's loosened up in a lot of ways. And, there's plenty of people doing interesting things with jazz and other forms of music. But, the jazz purists are, in many ways, like, pretty narrow. And that's why you get a situation where there are forms of jazz that, people just don't get to anymore.
Well, and that's exactly what I don't want to happen within the bluegrass genre, right? You don't want the gatekeeping and the saying, well, do you know, right? Like we always joke that that guys see somebody wearing a band's shirt and like, oh, can you name 3 songs? It's like, don't do that to a
No,
person, right? Like
that's wrong.
why do you have to put them on? Be like, hey, I'm glad you like this. Have you ever heard of this band? Expand their knowledge. Grow that sandbox instead of isolating it.
100%. It's like, when I used to go to these record stores in the village, they were like cool ones. I mean, there were sort of fancy ones that were expensive and, you know, a little frosty, but like some of the cool ones, like I remember like, oh my God, like, they would have these English imports and they'd play it for you. They'd just put it on and play it for you, and God, like that was so generous, and like that idea, yeah, I mean, God, name 3 songs, like, man, what the fuck are you trying to prove? Like, just let them have their t-shirt.
My favorite is being at a concert and somebody being, do you know how many times I've seen them? And it's
Yeah.
like, well, listen, if you actually saw them, they would probably want you to like be a little bit more welcoming and warming to somebody who maybe has not seen them as much as you. But for some reason, it's like you said, it's a power trip and it's this ego. And I feel like music is such a great proponent of ego death and like being able to associate and attach to things through music. And I don't understand why some of us feel like we then have to hoard that only for ourselves.
Well, that thing about the t-shirt thing too, I mean, maybe stereotyping here, but I really feel like there's a certain misogyny that goes along with that often. Like some girl is wearing a T-shirt of a band, you know, because she likes it as a T-shirt.
Yeah, like the Nirvana shirt.
Yeah,
Who
you know,
cares?
are they living and dying with every single song by that band? No, probably not. But you see some cool-looking girl wearing a T-shirt of a band. That makes an impact on me. I think like, oh wow, they're penetrating. They're kind of getting out there. Like, why would you? Why would you judge that? It's like you want to keep it for yourself, and deny it to other people, at whatever level.
But I also think this goes back to our double edged sword of like social media, right? And like wanting to be a part of a culture or a subculture, figuring out how you can attach to that and like the instant gratification. But then also on the other side, there's so many great musicians where somebody only gives them 3 or 10 seconds of a song to get in. You don't even get to the hook. You
Yeah,
don't even find the poetry in the lyrics.
right.
Because for us, it's like, I need this now, or else I'm moving on, fast forwarding to the next song. Skip.
Yeah, there's like, when you spend time around musicians, for the most part, I mean, not in every instance, but for the most part, it's incredible how open-minded they are. It's like music is like a language that you learn, and you can speak it to whoever can speak that language. And it's they don't. I remember talking to Peter Buck from REM one time, and he was saying, he goes, everybody's talking about grunge. He goes, I have never heard a musician use the term grunge. And it was pretty funny, but it was like sort of a way to say, like, that's something that people invented to kind of, to create, a genre or something. Peter was living in Seattle, and, it was just the music that people there were making,
Mm-hmm.
and, giving it a name and using that as a kind of exclusionary device is so unnecessary.
Why do you feel like we do it? Do you think that it's marketing executives figuring out how that they can then promote a specific sound or ideology?
There is that, you know, sad to say, critics want to come up with terminology, and that fair enough. That is a way of defining a certain sound or a certain movement. But anytime you've ever looked into a movement, I was living in Georgia when REM was getting going, and Pylon, the B-52s had, just left town, and there were so many bands, but people would always be talking about the Athens sound. And, all of those bands were so different. To me, what the Athens sound meant, and maybe this is what every great genre means, and certainly in the case of Billy Strings, I think what his style of music means is freedom. There was a kind of freedom that the bands in Athens had. They could try almost anything and create in whatever way they wanted. That was what made them great. That's what made them so exciting to see.
I can't have you talk about Athens bands without pointing over my shoulder to Waymonda Circle, which is the street sign from the house that the Widespread Panic originally had formed in. So like you're 1,000% right. But you look at that, you look at those different sounds from REM to Widespread Panic, all within the same years of each other that are coming and growing, but they have that faction. But do you feel like those communities then like push because you're seeing the outreach that people can have? And especially in the 80s, without the power of social media, which has really become dangerous because, yes, some people can really get out there, but also it's so flooded now that it's really hard to sift through some of this stuff to essentially break through. And maybe some of the greatest musicians of our time never had that determination to get through all of that monotony and nonsense that comes with our society today and that instant gratification.
Yeah. And people can sort of ride the terminology, if they want to, you know, we're a grunge band or we're from Athens or whatever it is, as a way to catch on, and understandably, I mean, it's tough. It's tough to make a living as a musician. People complain about it now, and it's true. It's tough now, but it was always tough. You know, wasn't so easy to make a living as a writer either.
I can tell you there's not a lot of money in podcasting either, but you make a lot of relationships, you build a community, and from that come more opportunities, and then it just continues to grow. And I think that by being genuine and sharing these things, music means so much to us, right? Especially in your and our stories, that it's makes sense that there are so many fans that also attach to that as well. What is it about music that you think draws in so many people?
Well, there is, not to get too fancy, but
Get fancy.
Plato, the well-known Greek philosopher, talked about music as kind of, he found music kind of dangerous. And the reason for that was that he felt it eluded intellect. It gets around it. And, me, I have a PhD in literature. Words and words and words. And probably if I had to say what is the most typical thing that editors have ever criticized my work for, they just, if I turn a piece in, they'll just say, this is great, but can you say something about the music? Because I'll be analyzing the lyrics and analyzing the lyrics. But even me, when I hear a song, man, if the music isn't happening and it doesn't catch me, I can't get there, no matter how good the lyrics are.
Well, and then I'm the opposite, Anthony, because for me, there's bands like Fish that are phenomenal musicians, but some of their lyrics make absolutely no sense to me, and I can't have that emotional connection because llama llama to boot, it just doesn't hit the same receptors.
Yeah. But you're responding to the music? Like you like the sound?
I do like the sounds, but I think that for me, the way that I listen, as a storyteller myself, I love, one of my favorite songs of all time is the Allman Brothers' Jessica. There's not a word in it, but it tells a story, right? With that journey, you can feel those roller coasters of the up and downs. You can get those emotions without a single word, which is why I'm a sucker for people that play instruments. I love to watch their fingers work. I love to hear the different sounds. Now that I have this opportunity to talk to them, I love finding out about their foundation, because then it starts to make sense. Oh, this is why they sound or play this like this, because they were inspired by this sound. And you start to see all these different layers and things that are happening, right? But that's what I love about music as a whole, and that's what I say is it's not just the instrumentation. The lyrics are just as important for me as the music itself.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, I would say, for me, it's weird. I'm about to contradict myself because, in some sense, ultimately, for me, the words are more important, ultimately. But I have to the immediacy of my response is to the music, to the hooks, man. I grew up with AM radio and, however widely my tastes have ranged, I still love hearing, great pop music. And I still want to hear something that's setting out to appeal to me. So I think that that is one of the complications of how music communicates, where it reaches you. And I think one of the reasons why we were talking about music and identity and the ability of music to summon up a period or summon up a time, summon up an experience, summon up a moment. Man, that's it's hard for any kind of art to do that, and music could do it. And I think because it has ways of just getting around your intellect. Maybe this means something to me because I feel like I live inside my head so much, that the immediacy of music, gets around that and speaks to me internally, speaks to my heart, not to get too.
No, but you, as you're speaking, all I'm thinking about is I have always told people that music is my religion, right? And going to these shows are a way for me to connect, and the interpretations of music can spread to all these different verticals and these different opportunities, and you can share these different mindsets that come with that music, right? And to celebrate and to have this spiritual connection and to question things, to build your morals. What are you thinking? What are these stories telling? How do they make you act out in the world? And I think that that's like art and music, it keeps getting pushed away in our society, but I think that it's never going to go away because it is so inspirational for us to find those moral standings, right? And to find that identity, like you said, and say, hey, this is something that I really attach to, and now I want to spread the good word to my other friends, right? And just like some of those religious outcryings, it's similar of like, hey, I want to share this with you, and I may sound like a crazy person, but then sometimes people come back and they're like, man, I've listened to you talk about this for 5 years, and I just went to Farm Aid and I saw this guy, and now I get what you're saying, right? And it's like, and then somebody that played before him, Jesse Wells, who is an amazing folk musician, has literally only blown up because of his songwriting and his short form videos on Instagram.
Yep.
And now you're playing on one of the biggest stages that is broadcast worldwide, and I think that that is so cool and it's so special. And for me, that's why I do this, is because I love music, and like you, I don't care. I will go to any show. I tell people all the time, tell me how I should experience it as a fan of this band, not as me myself, right? Like, and that's why, like, if I were to go and learn about Buddhism, I wouldn't come as like a Catholic or a Christian to go into Buddhism. I want, how do you practice, right? And I feel like that's for me what I've always tried to do, and it's been an amazing blessing because of that.
No, that is so true. Yeah, that is part of what, when I said before, you got to give things a chance. That's what giving it a chance is. Hearing it from the inside, you know, trying to enter it. And, look, it may take you somewhere, it may not. But, man, I've had so many experiences that I would have missed if I didn't open myself to them, you know? They're transporting.
So if you had to give a suggestion to our listeners now that have gotten to the end of this episode, what is it that you would challenge or tell them to do in their musical journey?
I would, there's so much around, and I get it when people feel overwhelmed by it. But try to find voices that you trust, whether those are your friends or music writers or musicians,
Podcasters.
yeah, podcasters,
Sorry.
I mean, anybody that is, has something to say to you about maybe what you like, and give it a whirl. I think that, people, we're speaking to a kind of defined group of people. I mean, some people don't care about music, you know, if music is important to you, look for new things. You don't have to, you know, I know like people say, well, I listened to this, I tried that, I didn't like it. It's like, okay, I get it. I think it's, if you want to keep your own taste fresh and your own experiences fresh, they have to get renewed, you know? They have to find, you have to find ways to renew them. So that's what I would suggest, is just try to, keep an open mind to what sources of new music that could potentially take you to a new place. And, look, beyond a certain point, people, I mean, it's harder past a certain age to go stand in a club for 3 hours, You don't have to necessarily go out and hear it. I mean, especially now, you can find so much live music. Well, that you can go sit in a seat and watch,
Or you can sit in a seat, and we call it couch tour. You can literally put up a live show and watch it.
exactly. And so, there's all kinds of possibilities, and, just be sure not to cut yourself off from those, to, remain available to them, and to, to the delights and kind of knowledge and pleasure that wisdom that music can deliver.
That's awesome. And Anthony, I can't thank you enough for taking the time and chatting with us today. If people wanted to reach out or if they had questions, is there somewhere that they can find you? Or I know that you've written multiple books. Let's plug some of the stuff that you do. Where can they hear more from your voice?
Well, I mean, if you Google my name, I mean, a million stories will come up. I feel like, and if there's something that you wanted to reach out for, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, and it's possible to just reach out to me in those places. And if you have a question or an observation or something, I will try to respond to it.
Well, and thank you for being such a receptive member in the community. I really appreciate it. And I promise this is not the last that you have heard from me, because you have just started a spark, and I really enjoy that you took the time today with us.
Well, no, absolutely, man. This was a great conversation, and I so appreciate your reaching out to me.
Awesome. And we'll see you guys next week.